Good to see each of you. Good to be here as part of this lectureship. Years ago, I remember taking a class on Bible study, and this was just a sort of a beginner's level class, and one of the things that they recommended was that you do character studies, that you get into the people in the Bible and learn more about their lives, and by learning about their lives, you can learn great lessons for your own life. That's what we're assigned to do this morning. We're going to be talking about the life of a man named Barnabas. He's well known in New Testament circles. He is one of the more prominent, what I would call second-tier characters in the Bible. He's not Peter or Paul or some of the others that are at the top of the list, but he's a very important character in terms of the history of the early church. I know that we cannot begin to cover everything about Barnabas' life in the short time that we have this morning. So I'm going to give a brief survey and stop along the way for three particular scenes that I think will help give us a good sampling of who this man is and what we can learn from him. The book of Acts in chapter 4 tells us about how the early church dealt with the problem of having some people there that were in great need. And one of the things that it mentions is how there were those who would sell their possessions and sell properties and use that money to help those that had some need. And Barnabas is introduced to us in that context. I'm making noise on something up here. I don't know why this is. Okay. In Acts 4, it talks there about Barnabas selling property that he owned and using that in the distribution to the needy saints. This is our first introduction to the man. We learn two important things about him immediately. Number one, we learn that he is a generous man. And number two, we learn that he is given this name, Barnabas, by the apostles who already knew him and were familiar with his life. They gave him a name that means the son of encouragement. And so Barnabas is a man who is constantly encouraging others to good work. The story continues in Acts chapter 9 there as the work begins to spread out from Jerusalem, and we've already seen there the work going on in Acts chapter 8, but in Acts chapter 9 the account is told there of the conversion of Saul of Tarsus. How that he encounters the vision of Jesus there on the road to Damascus. He travels into the city. There is met by Ananias, who tells him what he must do to be saved, and repeats to him his commission to go and preach the gospel. But when he comes to the city of Jerusalem, the church there is quite understandably afraid of him. It is Barnabas that steps up and makes the connection. He is the one that brings Paul to the apostles and the leaders of the church there and gives his word, vouches for Paul, or Saul as he's known at that time. And so again we see him working to encourage, in this case, someone who's going to be very important in the history of the church, but at this point he's still a new Christian, getting busy with his work. Barnabas is the one who opens the doors for him there in Jerusalem. And then we come to Acts chapter 11, and this is the first of the scenes that I want us to take a moment to look at. In Acts chapter 11, the gospel has come to the city of Antioch, and the church decides that they want to send someone there to help work with these new Christians at Antioch from Jerusalem, and they send this man Barnabas. Read with me beginning in Acts chapter 11, starting in verse 22. Then tidings of these things came unto the ears of the church which was in Jerusalem, and they sent forth Barnabas that he should go as far as Antioch, who when he came and had seen the grace of God was glad, and exhorted them all that with purpose of heart they would cleave unto the Lord. For he was a good man, and full of the Holy Ghost and of faith, and much people was added unto the Lord. Then departed Barnabas to Tarsus for to seek Saul, and when he had found him, he brought him unto Antioch. And it came to pass that a whole year they assembled themselves with the church, and taught much people, and the disciples were called Christians first in Antioch. Now, I want you to notice a few things from that reading. First of all, it tells us a good deal here about the attitude and character of this man Barnabas. It says there that when he came to Antioch and he had seen the grace of God. That's an interesting expression. He had seen the grace of God. What does grace look like? What did Barnabas see in this work at Antioch? I don't necessarily suppose there was any parting of the clouds and a bright light shining down on that congregation, but there were visible signs that were going on in that congregation that showed that God was working amongst those Christians to strengthen and encourage that congregation and to use them for spreading the gospel. The church at Antioch becomes one of the key centers for the spread of the gospel. That's the congregation that hosted, if you will, the 3 missionary journeys of the book of Acts. I submit to you that when you hear that expression that he had seen the grace of God, it tells us something about God being gracious to those that are working in His kingdom. And it tells us something about the church at Antioch, that they were blessed in the work that they were doing. But it also tells us something about Barnabas. I submit to you that the grace of God can be seen all around us in life if our minds and our hearts are open to see it. We need to learn to recognize that God is gracious, that God is good in the blessings that He pours out on us. And the blessings are not simply the things that make us feel better or give us more money in our pockets or something of that nature. But God's blessings are the ones that help us to become stronger and richer spiritually. Barnabas had an eye for seeing the grace of God. It also tells us here that he was a good man. A good man. I suppose that if you had to summarize one simple phrase that every Christian ought to aspire to, it's to be a good man or a good woman in the service of the Lord. That word in and of itself encapsulates so much of what we know about Barnabas. Most of the other things that we will read and study about in his life can be summarized in that simple phrase. He was a good man. I submit to you that not every man and not every woman is good. Now, there may be good things about most people. I understand that. But what does it take for us to truly be, in God's sight, a good man or a good woman? And the answer is that we need to be attuned to the spiritual duties of life, and we need to do them with a cheerful and ready heart. Barnabas was such a man. It tells us that he was full of the Holy Ghost and of faith. And so here is a man who is, in character, the ideal man for this work that needed to be done at Antioch. Notice also the words of Barnabas here. It says that he exhorted them that with purpose of heart they would cleave unto the Lord. With purpose of heart. Barnabas encouraged these people to live a purposeful life. And a life that has the right intentions and the right convictions and commitments. We need to be encouraging one another in the work of Christian living, that we would live with purpose of heart. Being a good Christian is not something we do by accident or we do it on the side. It needs to be a conviction and a determination in our hearts. You need to be convicted yourself. You need to have that purpose of heart. And you need, like Barnabas, to encourage others to that purpose of heart. And what was specifically the purpose he wanted them to have? It says here that they would cleave unto the Lord. In the illustrations that Jesus gave about His work, one of the common illustrations He used was comparing Himself to a shepherd. You know, one of the jobs that a shepherd has is to take the sheep that are beginning to wander off and to guide them back to the fold. Sometimes Christians begin to move away from God, and they get a little distance between themselves and the good Lord. Barnabas said, I want you to make up your mind, to have purpose of heart, to cleave unto the Lord, to keep yourself near Him. That's going to mean encouraging people in the work of prayer and of Bible study, encouraging them in the fellowship of fellow Christians, encouraging them in the business of working and carrying the gospel to the lost. All of these things help to keep us close to the Lord. Barnabas encouraged these Christians to a faithful life. Notice the strategy that he has there. For one thing, it says that he went and found Saul and brought him to Antioch. Barnabas is not seeking his own glory. He is what we might call a team player. And he selected someone here who could help him carry out this work. Amen. We need to find people who can be of service to the Lord and give them the opportunities to serve. Now, I will say not everyone is ready to offer their service to the Lord in this sense. What I mean by that is some people have not made that commitment of heart. There's an old strategy I've heard for years and years and years, and I understand where you're coming from when you present an idea like this, but I think there is a flaw in the thinking that says if you've got some member that's not faithful, that doesn't show up very much, that doesn't participate very much, well, give them jobs to do, and that will make them more faithful. In my experience, that rarely works. Amen. What works is to find people who are already doing their best and encourage them to move on to the next level and take on a little more responsibility. Those are the people that can be of the most service. And Paul was certainly such a person. Barnabas recognized that and brought him to Antioch to help with this work. They worked with the church for a whole year. Now, I grant you that in some respects a year can be a very short time. But we need to understand that getting a congregation or even an individual Christian to grow spiritually is not an overnight process. We need to be prepared to commit some time to the work. Notice that he assembled with this congregation. For a whole year they assembled themselves with the church. You want to be a Barnabas? You're going to have to spend some time around your fellow Christians to carry on this work. And then finally it says he taught much people. Barnabas, in almost every scene that we look at, is in some way or another involved in teaching. Either teaching Christians how to grow spiritually, or in teaching those that are lost how to become Christians so that they might grow spiritually. And what was the result? It says there that much people was added unto the Lord. Because Barnabas and the congregation and Paul, because they were all working together, people were added to the Lord. Now, there's nothing that can guarantee that any one action or any one opportunity will always add someone to the church. But there is something I can guarantee you, that if we don't do what Barnabas and Paul were doing, if we don't do what the church at Antioch was doing, we're not going to see much in the way of adding to the church at all. We need to be busy about encouraging and strengthening the church, and we'll begin to see people want to be a part of that. Finally, it says here that the disciples were called Christians first at Antioch. There are discussions that have gone on for many, many years about whether this was a God-given name. Many people believe that it was given in answer to a prophecy in Isaiah of a new name, or whether it was something that was applied perhaps by the enemies of the church in slander. Here's what I know the Bible says about this subject. It says that when Paul stood before Agrippa, and Agrippa said, "Almost thou persuadest me to be a Christian," you remember Paul's response? He said, "I wish that you and everyone here that hears me today were both almost and altogether such as I am, except these bonds." Paul said, "I want everyone that that hears my voice to be a Christian. A few years later, the Apostle Peter wrote in his letter there the simple admonition, if any man suffer as a Christian, let him not be ashamed, but let him glorify God on this behalf. The name Christian is a name to take pride in. It is a name to be glorified in. Not to glorify ourselves and say, oh, look at how righteous and holy we are, but to glorify the one whose name we wear, Jesus Christ. And so we move on. At the end of chapter 9 and on into chapter 11, we have their involvement in the work of carrying support and sustenance to the congregation at Jerusalem. When there was a famine there was a great need. Then we come to Acts chapter 15. In Acts chapter 15, we have there the Holy Spirit coming to the leadership of the church at Antioch and saying, separate me, Barnabas and Saul. Or Barnabas and Paul, if you prefer. I said 15, I meant 13, I apologize. Acts chapter 13, separate me, Barnabas and Saul, for the work whereunto I called them. This is the beginning of what we refer to as the first missionary journey. These two men set out, carried with them a young man by the name of Mark. We'll say more about him in a moment. But they began to travel outside of the region where they had been working for some time now to carry the gospel to other parts of the world. They first go to the island of Cyprus, which, by the way, if you go back to Acts chapter 4, you find that that was Barnabas' home. And so they come to the place that Barnabas was most familiar with, and they begin to preach the gospel there. The story is told about how they convert one of the governors of the island there, in spite of the resistance of a man who was trying to speak against him. You remember Paul caused this man to be blinded, and the governor saw what was happening there, and saw the power, and he was convinced of the truth, and he became a Christian. The fact is that as you read through this first missionary journey, you will read it, as most of us do, and as the text says, primarily as what Paul was doing. And yet Barnabas is there. And I want you to notice something interesting that happens as you read through this account. Whereas the story begins by talking about Barnabas and Saul, or then Barnabas and Paul, very quickly it becomes Paul and Barnabas. And it suggests here that there is a change in, if you will, the prominence of these two men. That Paul became the more prominent man of the group. As a matter of fact, in Acts chapter 13, if you look there at verse and I'm drawing a blank. I thought I had my hand right on it. Check my notes here. Verse 13, that's what I'm looking for. Acts 13 and verse 13. When Paul and his company loosed from Paphos. Look at that phrase. Paul and his company. Now the company was Barnabas. And for the moment, John Mark. John Mark leaves at the end of that verse. But Paul is clearly singled out here as the leader of the group. The interesting thing that I want us to understand as we're reading here this account is what's not in the text. Nowhere is there a single hint of an idea that Barnabas in any way resented Paul's rise in prominence. Now that's an important thing to note, because human nature tends to work in the other direction. If you have some fame or prominence or importance, and then someone else rises above you and begins to eclipse you, human nature is that there's a bit of resentment about that. Who is he? I was the one who was the leader. I was the one who brought him in. He wouldn't even be accepted in the church if I hadn't stepped up and spoken for him. Barnabas could easily have thought like that. Many people certainly would. Many people do. don't see any of that in Barnabas. What we see instead is a man who is focused, number one, on the good work that needs to be done. And if that work can be most effectively done with Paul stepping out front and being the spokesman for the group, Barnabas was fine with that. Number two, he's focused on the value that Paul himself has. Barnabas was not jealous of Paul. He admired Paul, respected Paul. That's one of the reasons he had went to get him and to bring him to Antioch, because he knew the kind of leader that he could be. And so Barnabas' humility here is something that is something to be admired and modeled in our lives. The story of the missionary journey ends in chapter 14, and we have there a summary as they come back to the church at Antioch. Acts 14 at verse 26, it says, "They sailed thence to Antioch, from whence they had been recommended to the grace of God for the work which they had fulfilled. When they were come and had gathered the church together, they rehearsed all that God had done with them, and how He had opened the door of faith unto the Gentiles. And it says, there they abode a long time with the disciples." I will encourage you to do a study on your own, because we don't have time to do it. But go back through the accounts of Barnabas in the book of Acts and notice how often the subject of the grace of God is interwoven in his life. It says here they had been recommended to the grace of God. The marvelous work that was done in this missionary journey and in the journeys that followed and in the other work throughout the New Testament was a result of the hard work put forth by those individual Christians, but it's also the work of the grace of God. I submit to you, it says they rehearsed all that God had done with them. There is a value in, some of you know we meet together down in Hazelhurst once a month for what we call Preacher's Luncheon. We have area reports. There's a value in sharing the good work that's going on where you are with others. It's an encouragement to know that the gospel is succeeding in its work of going out into the world. We come then to Acts chapter 15. And in Acts chapter 15, there is a problem. That seems to be the pattern all through history. It's still very much true today, that whenever the church begins to be prosperous and successful and things seem to be making good progress, problems come along. Maybe it's just the old devil wanting to put a stop to things, but in this case, the problem involved bringing in all of these Gentiles into what had been pretty much a Jewish institution. Now, it was not Jesus' intention that it be a Jewish institution. When He sent the gospel, the apostles into the world, He says, go into all the world, preach the gospel to every creature. And so it was always the plan to move beyond the Jewish people to the rest of the world. But there were some in the church that did not like the idea of bringing in these Gentiles, and they said, well, at the very least, if we're going to let these Gentiles into the church, they need to be circumcised. And so that became a difficult issue in this first generation of the church. And in Acts 15, they come to Jerusalem there to discuss with the apostles and elders of the church there the question of these Gentiles coming into the church. We have Paul and Barnabas reporting there on that first missionary journey, and how not only had they been successful, but they tell them that this was what God had instructed them to do, and God had blessed this work. God Himself had been behind that missionary journey. So it's not something that should be spoken against lightly. When the affair is over here and they've had their meeting, the end result is that we want to tell these Gentile Christians that they need to stay away from their idolatry, but we're not going to enforce circumcision on the Gentiles. Galatians chapter 2, Paul reports on this occasion, and he says that they extended to me and to Barnabas the right hand of fellowship. That means two things. Number one, it means that they supported and endorsed the work that Paul and Barnabas were doing. And number two, it means that they were cooperative in their effort, that Peter and Paul were not in competition. They were working together in fellowship to spread the gospel wherever they could. And so, with this particular issue dealt with, at least at that point, the idea comes to the mind of Barnabas and Saul to go on to a second missionary journey. And this is our third scene that I want us to look at. The account is told in Acts chapter 15, near the end of the chapter. It says in verse 36, some days after, Paul said unto Barnabas, let us go again and visit our brethren in every city where we have preached the word of the Lord, and see how they do. And Barnabas determined to take with them John, whose surname was Mark. But Paul thought not good to take him with them, who departed from them from Pamphylia, and went not with them to the work. The contention was so sharp between them that they departed asunder one from the other. And so Barnabas took Mark and sailed into Cyprus, and Paul chose Silas and departed, being recommended by the brethren unto the grace of God. He went through Syria and Cilicia, confirming the churches. They're going on a second missionary journey. And the purpose of it, at least at first, is simply to go back and visit these congregations that they had already established and encourage them and help them in whatever needs they may have. But an issue comes up about John Mark. Back in chapter 13, we read there that John had left them when they got away from Cyprus and came up into the southern regions there near the Galatian territory, the Pisidian territory. He turns around and he comes home. I don't know why he came home. The text doesn't tell us. Maybe he got homesick. Maybe he was already seeing some of the persecution that was to be faced and he was simply afraid. I don't know what his reason was. All I know is that Paul did not think that it was good, that there was not a justification for what he had done. When you read the account here, there are a couple of words that stand out. It says there that Barnabas determined to take with them John. And the word here, translated determined, means that he had put some thought into this. This was not just an off-the-cuff suggestion, but rather he had consciously and deliberately thought to bring John Mark. That means he had reasons for it. There was something in Barnabas' mind that said, I think we need to bring John Mark on this journey. Then it says, Paul thought not good to take him with him. The idea here is that he did not believe that John Mark was worthy to take with him. That's what the word literally says there. He doesn't deserve to be brought onto this trip because he left us. Now, what was Barnabas thinking? I think we can pretty much know what Paul was thinking. And I'm not saying Paul was wrong. But what was Barnabas thinking? Was Barnabas thinking, well, this is going to be too big a job for me and Paul. We're going to need somebody to help us. Let's get John. No. They had been to these places before, and they were going back again, and he knew they would be able to do the work. He was thinking about John Mark himself. He was thinking, this young man needs a second chance. He needs the opportunity to get past this decision that he made and to move on with his spiritual life, his Christian life. I know that he still has a lot to offer. Over the next few years of his life, John Mark had to live with both of those things. He had to live with the fact that he had disappointed Paul. And he had to live with the fact that Barnabas had faith in him that he could overcome it. I don't know all of the details in John Mark's life. It doesn't tell us. But we do know that he went on to write one of the gospel accounts of Jesus' life. We do know that he is involved in the work later, and Paul himself on 2 occasions commends John Mark for his good work. And so it is true that John Mark overcame his difficulty, and I have no doubt that one of the reasons, one of the big reasons that he was able to move past this mistaken judgment or whatever it was the fact that he had someone who believed in him even though he had disappointed others. Barnabas was called the son of encouragement. And I don't know any episode in his life that better illustrates the fact that he deserved that name than the way